So I'm going to invite Carly Joint up on stage in a moment to bring us a little music to bring this room together before we begin the program. Carly Joint, please, she's going to ask all of us to participate in one way or another, so good luck with that.
Hello. I'm on? Can you hear me? All right, how's everyone doing out there? No, Marcia, how are you doing? Are you feeling comfortable? Don't get too used to that. Okay, so I'm actually up here to share with you a tool of connecting people to nature, which is music. And a lot of people are kind of surprised to hear that we use music in our programs where I work. I work for a couple of different nature connection places here in the city. And we use music as a tool to reconnect ourselves back to nature. And if you do look at some cultures today that are still living really closely to the land, really closely to nature, you'll also find that there is a lot of singing that happens there. And so I'm going to invite you to come with me on a bit of a ride, which might start in a place that feels uncomfortable. And then I'm going to invite you to stay there with me, even if you might not want to, until we get to a place that feels absolutely amazing. This song has no words. There's no translation. All it is sounds. And it was taught to me by a songstress named Kata from New York. And she just learned it. I don't even think it has a real big history. It's a super simple song. And even if you don't think that you are a musician or a singer, I think that this song might even change your mind. So we're going to have 3 sections, kind of the first 5 rows, the next 5 rows, and the back 5 rows. And so the first 5 rows, I need you to be with me here, though. I need you guys to not give up on me, because if it's just me singing up here, it's not going to sound very good. Okay. So the first part goes like this. Ah-ha-ma-ma-ma, ah-ha-ma-ma-ma, ah-ha-ma-ma-ma.
Can I be louder?
Ah-ha-ma-ma-ma.
Right.
Ah-ha-ma-ma-ma, ah-ha-ma-ma-ma. Oh, yeah. Ah-ha-ma-ma-ma. Ah-ha-ma-ma-ma. Even louder. Ah-ha-ma-ma-ma. 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 Really loud. Ah-ha-ma-ma-ma. Oh, yeah. Ah-ha-ma-ma-ma. Ah-ha-ma-ma-ma. Okay, you guys are going to keep going, and the second part goes like this. Shalai-a-lai-a-lai, 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 shalai-a-lai-a-lai. That's that middle group, okay? Really loud. Lai-a-lai, shalai-a-lai-a-lai, shalai-a-lai-a-lai. Even louder. Lie. Shalai. Okay, keep going. And don't think I forgot about you there in the back. You guys are next. You're my high part. Get your high voices out. Ooh, wee, ooh, wee, ooh, wee, ooh. Ooh, wee, ooh, wee, ooh, wee, ooh. Oh yeah, and stand up. Ooh, wee, ooh, wee, ooh, wee, ooh. Really loud. Ooh, wee, ooh, wee, ooh, wee, ooh. As loud as you can. Shalai, 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 shalai. And keep going. extra loud, and just close your eyes for a sec, and forget you're standing in a crowd, and just listen to that beautiful sound. Shalai-a-lai-a-lai, 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 shalai-a-lai-a-lai. Ooh-wee-oo, 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 ooh-wee. And everyone just a hum-a-ma-ma, hum-a-ma-ma, a hum-a-ma-ma, a hum-a-ma-ma, a hum-a-ma-ma, a hum-a-ma-ma. Thank you very much. You all sounded beautiful.
Thank you, Carly. Oh, no, maybe I'll come here. I wonder if I'm live here. Yes. Thank you, Carly. Warming up the room. Was worried about the weather a little bit, as we have been for this entire year, quite frankly. But more of the same. And we've dressed, most people seem to have dressed properly for the evening. We were actually wondering, do we get heaters or do we get blankets? But anyway, it seems to have turned out just fine. So my name is Jeff Cape, and I have the great privilege of being the CEO of Evergreen, which has been an incredible career ride for me, quite frankly, for upwards of 25 years now. And this project here at Evergreen Brickworks, or at the Brickworks as most people know it, has been really one of the most amazing experiences where we've had the opportunity to connect the big idea of nature as an idea, as a design concept into the fabric of the city in a very fundamental way. And for most of the last 25 years, we've been focused on public spaces, school grounds, public parks, river valleys of various sorts across the country, working in communities across the country. I think we've worked with, well, upwards of 5,000 projects across the country. And then we finally woke up maybe 10 years ago and realized that what we really needed was a facility, a hub for this idea, a venue where we could bring people together to talk about this incredible opportunity to integrate nature into the design of cities in a more sophisticated way. Because in many cases, in many moments, our ideas were referred to as cute and kind of nice, and oh, isn't it great, the kids are planting trees in the school ground, and that all felt lovely and fun. But the reality of the issue is that it's a really deeply strategic move. It's a deeply transformative idea that is massively bigger than the simple moment of putting a tree in the ground with a number of kids and participants. So how could we create a site that would express the scale of the idea, the scale of the opportunity to transform our living environments, to transform our cities? And well, with many of you helping, many of you specifically, individuals in the room here helping, we've been able to accomplish a huge step towards that, which is taking an old industrial site, an old factory complex with 16 buildings on a 42-acre site in the middle of the city. It takes me 15 minutes to bike from here home. Right in the middle of the fourth largest city in North America, we've been able to create a site that sits essentially right in the middle of this incredible natural oasis, which is also the ravine system that binds together the entire city. And I don't know how many of you realize how incredibly important the strategic value of the ravines are, but also how important they are just to connect the city. So Toronto has the largest ravine system of any city in the world. It's 27,000 acres. They came into play back in the 1950s, 1953 or 4, I can't remember exactly, when Hurricane Hazel visited and flooded the city. And the city, to its wisdom, with the provincial government, realized that we needed to protect the valleys, the ravine system, as a stormwater management strategy, as a way to get the waters to move through the city in the event of a large hurricane, a large flooding. Well, certainly it's played that role. It doesn't mean this site floods periodically, by the way, but what we've ended up with is an amazing asset, and that is this incredible natural system that links so many communities across the city. So Anyway, that's enough about this site, because many of you probably know it already. If you haven't been down to the farmers market this summer, please come down and visit, because we now serve wine, which is incredibly smart thing to be doing. So wine being served as of 8:30 in the morning, by the way, for those who care to indulge, as I did the other day. Anyway, it is my privilege to welcome, well, two people, I suppose, but Cam Collier, who's right here, and he's going to be taking over after I run over to another meeting, believe it or not, here on site today. The Global Alliance for the Future of Food is being discussed with 35 foundations from around the world in the Cafe Belong right now, which is an amazing event. But I'm going to try to figure out how to run between this one and the other one, because Cam Collier is an amazing friend, a very dear friend of mine, quite frankly. I've worked with him now for 15, 16 years. He has taken on this idea of nature and school grounds on a national level, but he's also become very quickly, 15 years, overnight success, become an international celebrity in the realm of children and nature and school grounds, speaking all over the world, Berlin, Seoul, Korea last summer, and founded the International School Ground Alliance. I think that's what the name of it is. Anyway, he's an amazing leader in this space, and we're privileged. We at Evergreen are very, very happy and privileged to have him with us. And another really wonderful leader who has made his mark in a number of different places, John Godfrey, who in many respects is a co-host tonight as the head of the Toronto French School. John Godfrey has made his mark in academics on a variety of levels, both as a university professor, but also as a politician. Many of you might know that John was the incredible visionary, if I can put it that way, John, because I think you were, in trying to formulate a big idea for Canada to create an urban strategy, a strategy that would bring the cities together under a framework nationally. And as a member of the Liberal Party, he had an incredible vision and big ideas around that thought. What else can I tell you about John? Yes, Don Valley West from 93 to 2008. There are the specifics of his career. But I am introducing John because he gets the privilege of introducing our guest speaker tonight. Thank you very much.
Jeff, what happened to the windows? There are no windows. He tells me that when they can afford them, they'll put in windows. Well, we've had our kumbaya moment and it came early. You were great. I want to welcome you all, members of the TFS community, members of the Toronto community, supporters of bringing nature back into our lives. Welcome to this event. I welcome you on behalf of TFS and, as Jeff has said, the Evergreen Brickworks. I have to tell you that earlier today we had a conference called Brainpower du Nord at TFS and at Glendon. It was subtitled Transformations in Teaching. And this conference brought together neuroscientists and like-minded experts with teachers, and the idea was to translate research into practice so that our children will be the beneficiaries in their learning. It was an extraordinary event, and our guest speaker tonight, Richard Louv, was part of it. And it was also about encouraging that conversation so that whatever we do in teaching is informed by our latest understanding, and that includes our latest understanding of nature. Now, as we sit in this twilight zone, literally in the middle of the city, fourth largest, as Jeff says, we're reminded of this extraordinary place where we live. And when Jeff talked a little bit about the ravine structure, it made me realize what an extraordinary thing the ravine is in the life of the city of Toronto. There's a wonderful German word called Heimat, which literally translates as homeland, and there's a German film called Heimat. But more abstractly, it translates as that sense of place which tells you you are here and not there, that you could be nowhere else than where you are. Though that thing which gives Paris or New York or Barcelona their distinctive characteristic which tells you I'm here. In Toronto, that thing which tells you I'm here is the ravine. It's our spine of nature. It's our lungs. It turns out, as I was reflecting on this, it turns out to be the spine of my own life. When I was born many years ago, the first house I was living in was on Heath Street East, which is just at Yonge and St. Clair, and it dead ends onto the ravine. The first school I went to was Deer Park Public School, which also abuts the ravine north of here. When I was 10 years old, I moved south to Elm Avenue in Rosedale, and I was 2 blocks from the ravine. 2 blocks from a place called, which was in those days called Osler Park, now rather more pretentiously Craigleith Gardens. It's up the real estate value in Rosedale. And a place which is still prosaically known as Milkman's Hill. I played from the age of 10 on in that ravine. We didn't worry about creeps or deadbeats, we were just told to avoid them. We played, and we played. And later, when I was interested in photography, I went down there as an adolescent and was developing my own black and white photographs that I'd taken in the ravine. When I was 14, I met with a group of Central European refugees who had come from various communist countries who were interested in riding. And in those days, what we now call Todmorden Mills was a livery stable called Whitewood Stable, and it was run by Sergeant Whitewood, who had been in the Boer War. And for $2 an hour, you could go riding at 10 or 11 or 12, depending on how lazy you were on a Saturday morning. And so I rode through this place, the clatter on the bricks, when this was just a deserted place. That's my memory of this. Later, I became an urban terrorist because they were planned. This is before they had the Don Valley Parkway, and I think Richard may and I may share this in common. I made it my effort to take out all the stakes, the survey stakes, for the Don Valley Parkway. I'm afraid it didn't work over the long haul, but I gave it my best shot until they started embedding the damn stakes in cement. I moved away for 17 years, and then I moved back to Castle Frank to an apartment, and I found myself running in the ravine, and I found myself running what is in the old colonial railway line, which they've taken up, and I would run from there to Moore Avenue and back. So I was back in the ravine. I got married. I got married in a church called St. Simon's, which is across the ravine from Rosedale, and you take a bridge to get there. And then when we had the reception, that was at the Rosedale Golf Club, which is opposite the ravine. And then I became an MP for Don Valley West. That is the west side of the ravine. There's also Don Valley East. You can see how there's a bit of a theme emerging in my life here. I then moved back to Toronto to become head of the Toronto French School. Did I mention that's on the ravine? And I live in a place called Cedarvale, which is, guess what, on another part of the ravine over to the west. Well, that's my story, and I suspect that there are many stories like that in this room of people who unconsciously, the story of their life has been their story of the relationship with the ravine. I say all this because I want to give that sense of place to our wonderful guest speaker, Richard Louv, who did such a fantastic job speaking to us all earlier. Richard is a lucky man. He has published a book which has changed the course of living and education in North America. Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. He's the guy that coined the phrase which has helped start to reverse the trend of being disconnected from nature. Through a growing body of research on the topic, he shows us how direct exposure to nature is essential for healthy child development and for the physical, emotional health of children and adults. He could not possibly full of nature in our increasingly and overwhelming digital world. How much tech is too much tech has been the cry. More recently, he's published the Nature Principle, Human Restoration and the End of Nature Deficit Disorder, aimed at getting us as adults now back into the natural world. We're very fortunate to have him speak at our conference today. We're fortunate to have him here tonight. By way of background, he's a journalist and an author. His book, which I mentioned, Last Child in the Woods, has been published in 15 countries, translated into 10 languages. He's also the author of The Nature Principle, the whole question about hybrid minds, which I think he's going to speak to us tonight. He's the founding chair of the Children and Nature Network, an organization helping to build a movement of children and teachers and adults and future generations to combine their efforts to participate in the natural world. In 2008, he was awarded the Audubon Medal by the National Audubon Society. In short, we're very lucky to have the man for the hour and the place, our own bit of Heimat, Richard Louv.
Thank you, John. I have to say that earlier when I heard John introduced, I knew he was the headmaster of the school, which is a wonderful school I spent the morning at. But I didn't know his prior role, and I heard him introduced as a former minister. So tonight I was going to ask him which church, and fortunately then I found out it was the government. So first I have to say that I hope no one minds, I don't use PowerPoint. Is that all right? Okay, good. And it's not because I'm ideologically against PowerPoint. Well, kind of, but not really. I tried PowerPoint twice. The first time I did everything wrong, too much information on it was awful. The second time, it was a pretty big crowd, and I really worked on it because everybody does PowerPoint. So I figured I got to get with it. So I'm up there and I'm speaking, I'm clicking, I'm speaking, I'm clicking, and I'm seeing people really look at my PowerPoint. I mean, they're really paying attention. And I figured I've nailed it. I'm really good at PowerPoint now. And then finally, I turned around and realized that my screensaver had gone on, and it was photographs of my wife and I on a beach in Mexico, and she looked really good. So I haven't done PowerPoint since. I don't know, maybe I'd do better if I replicated that. I want to say first that the French school, my experience this morning with teachers was so great. There are so many deeply committed teachers and headmasters, principals, school board members, and others in education that are committed to this. There are also many pediatricians. More and more pediatricians are prescribing nature, literally. I might talk about that later. There are even developers who are developing new kinds of neighborhoods and communities and hopefully redeveloping decaying neighborhoods that have not only more people in them, but more quote-unquote natural habitat. And there are places like this. And I took a tour of this earlier. And I have this theory that the great future is already out there. But it's in bits and pieces. And it's a collage we don't put together visually. We don't really see it around us, but it's there. And this is one of those places. I have a theory. It's not based on science, though I think there's a little bit of science to back this up. I've become convinced that most North Americans, and perhaps most Europeans, and perhaps the world, when we think of the far future, the first images that come to mind, the ones that surface, even if it's only subconscious, are images that look a lot like Blade Runner or Mad Max, or at best the Hunger Games. At least there's some trees. It's a post-apocalyptic future. The number one selling genre of literature for young adults in fiction is called dystopic fiction. Dystopia. It's about that post-apocalyptic future. Now, I have nothing against dystopic literature. 1984, Brave New World, good warnings. But I do have a problem with the fact that I don't think our culture has another set of images of a great future. And I don't mean a sustainable future. I use the word sustainable. I'm not opposed to the word sustainable. But I can tell you that particularly young people, if you use that word, most people associate that with energy efficiency. And that's where it stops. Oh yeah, we got to do that. Very important to be sustainable, very important to recycle, etc. It's about saving energy. That to me is the baseline. That's the bare minimum. I'm really interested also in producing human energy. And I think the lack of this set of images is a problem. I think it is our #1 mental health issue in North America. By that I mean the way we talk to our kids and ourselves about the future. I was sitting with some students at DePaul University recently. These were environmental studies students. Took me to lunch. And first, the first guy that spoke said, young guy said that he tried to join the local Sierra Club, some of the local national environmental organizations. And he said he really tried, but he just couldn't get with the program. There were a couple reasons. The first one was, he said, no offense, Mr. Louv, but they all look like you. And what he meant by that was, in his terms at least, I hate this, but in his terms, it meant old and white. And it's true. If you look at the big, and I don't know for sure this is true in Canada, I suspect it is, but if you look at the big organizations, big environmental organizations in the US, one of the biggest, and I never name it because I don't want to embarrass them because they do great work, but one of the very biggest environmental organizations, the average age is 78 of the members. The average new member is 74. The old members get together and haze the new members. And this is true, and the environmental organizations know that. They know they're in danger of aging out. They also know that they are not diverse. They don't look like North America. That's a problem in terms of the future. Big problem for the future of conservation ethic and for the environmental movement. Now, I want to say that I don't take anything, no one can take anything away from the successes of the environmental movement. I'm old enough, I was in college in the first Earth Day, and I'm old enough to remember rivers that caught fire when I was in high school that were still burning when I got out of college. And those rivers now are great fisheries because of the Clean Water Act. Again and again, the environmental movement succeeded, but now it's having some problems. And I think it's up against 3 huge challenges that are all interrelated. One, of course, is climate change. I'm from San Diego. I don't know if you've been watching the news, but my city is burning up, literally. The second one is the collapse of biodiversity. We see that happening every day with the disappearance of species. Yes, we find some new ones, but basically we're witnessing a biodiversity collapse. And the third one is the disconnect between children and nature, which means adults and nature. Many of the kids that I interviewed for Last Child are now voters. Those 3 huge issues And I'm sure there are other ones, but those three huge issues, you can't, I believe, do much about any of them if you don't do something about all of them. But there's another problem, and these students that took me to lunch, a young woman across the table, a very hip young woman, I know that because she had tattoos, she said to me, I'm 20 years old, and all my life I've been told it's too late. And she repeated it. I'm 20 years old, and all my life I've been told it's too late. And I thought, oh my God, she's right. You know, I've been in journalism a long time. I'm not sure what I am now, but I was a journalist for a long time. And that 20 years is the window in which my profession has basically been saying, in so many words, over and over again, it's too late. We kind of get a gleeful joy out of that. Environmental movement also has been saying, in so many words, it's too late. Now, I want to say that it says other things too. There are hopeful messages out there, both from journalism and the environmental movement. And other sectors, there are hopeful statements out there. But do they add up to an image of a great future? That was the second reason. The young man who said he tried to join the big environment, he says, it's too depressing. He says, it's such a downer. I get no hope from it. That's not to say that we need to replace the bad news with happy news. I'm, as I say, a journalist by background, and I'm allergic to happy news for happy news' sake. I break out in hives. But I think we've been missing a big part of the picture. The civil rights movement, which I often talk about as a parallel to what we're facing now. Martin Luther King said again and again that any movement, any culture will fail if it cannot paint a picture of a world that people will want to go to. Do we have that picture in our mind? Do we have those images? I don't think we do. At best, we've got maybe a robots are us future, which is kind of unsatisfying, except for robots, I guess. Or we've got a sustainable future. And again, I'm not saying we shouldn't be sustainable as defined, as most people understand that word, even though I know it has a wider meaning also. But that seems to me to be the bare minimum. You know, Bill McDonough, the great green guru who wrote Cradle to Cradle, believes everything can be recycled. I finally met him, and his German business partner came to a speech I gave and said, Bill is in this city, and I'd never met him. He's a hero of mine. Come tomorrow, we'll go see him. We went to see him. And Bill McDonough likes to say, do you really want a sustainable marriage? Don't you want something better than that? Now, sometimes a sustainable marriage is just fine. I understand that. But what he's saying is, and what I'm saying is that that word sounds like stasis. It sounds like a stalling time. It sounds like bare survival, just making it. Maybe things not getting a whole lot worse. That's not a real inspiring idea. McDonough says, here's what environmentalism, or recently, tends to do with all the best intentions. Your carbon footprint is too big. Your carbon footprint is way too big. Your carbon footprint is big. Your carbon footprint is too big. Now, that is true. There's nothing untrue about that. But he said the subtext of that message is, we'd be better off without you. We'd be better off without you and you and you. That's no way to sell the future. That's no way to sell an idea, you know? He has a different way of looking at it, which fits it. I swear this, I had already written the Nature Principle, but I swear he stole this from my book, but he didn't. It's a great, I wish I'd quoted him in the book. He said, what if we looked at that footprint in a different way? What if everywhere we stepped, we left a wetlands? One of the basic messages of the Nature Principle is conservation is no longer enough. Now we need to create nature. As strange as that sounds, we need green roofs that bring back butterfly migration routes and so forth. This place, in a sense, is creating nature. Now, you could call it restoration if you want, but it doesn't feel like a redo. It feels like something new. Those students at that table, including the woman who said, all I've been told is it's too late, want to do something creative and beautiful and new. They don't want to just have their finger in the dike. They want to build a new city, a new way of life. And they get excited when they talk about that. The civil rights movement didn't for a second stop talking about the bad news. In fact, as the years went on, they talked about it more and more. It became angrier. But they had this other thing. They had this dream that King described. And you could see it. You could see that future. Someday, maybe. And that's what people held on to. Do we have that? Particularly when it comes to those three big environmental issues. So I want to read you something because I often talked about that over the years in my speeches. I've been very inspired by what King and many others did. And I was talking about that at an audience about this big of middle school and high school students. It was in Indiana, tough crowd. And afterwards, in the Q&A period, a young woman stood up, a senior in high school, and she said, well, that's all fine, Mr. Louv, but I haven't seen your picture yet, the picture you paint. I said, well, I've written 2 books. And she says, I don't want to read your books. I want you to paint that picture for me right now. And she demanded it. So I gave it a shot, and I knew she was right. And I gave it a shotgun shot. And this is what I said, and I came back and wrote it, and then we put it at the end of the paperback edition of the Nature Principle. It begins with a quote from Alfred Lord Tennyson. The long day wanes, the slow moon climbs, the deep moans round with many voices. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Imagine a world in which all children grow up with a deep understanding of the life around them, where all of us know the animals and plants of our own backyards, as well as we know the televised Amazon rainforest, or better, where the more high-tech our lives become, the more we experience nature in our lives, where we come to all of our senses, including our sense of humility, where we feel more alive. We seek a newer world where we not only conserve nature, but create it, where we live, work, learn, and play, where yards and open space are alive with native species, where bird migration routes are healed by human care, where wildlife corridors in every city serve as the bronchial and arterial passages of life and meaning, just as your ravines do here. Where not only public space, but private property voluntarily, garden to garden, is transformed by us, yard to yard, into butterfly zones, and then across the country into a homegrown national park. Where neighbors use land trust law to create their own button parks, small enough to sew on themselves. Where cities become incubators of biodiversity. Where every hospital offers a healing garden and pediatricians and other health professionals prescribe nature, where park rangers become para-health professionals, where antidepressants and pharmaceuticals are prescribed less and nature prescribed more, because nearby nature provides healing and reduces stress, where obesity of children and adults is reduced through nature play, where cities produce their own energy, where empty lots become natural play spaces, where community gardens for children and adults, where skyscrapers become vertical farms with spirals and decks and roofs that reduce stress even as they produce food, where biophilic design moves green architecture even beyond the goal of conserving energy and toward the creation of environments that produce human energy in the form of higher productivity, greater health, more ability to concentrate and create. Where developers not only create new neighborhoods that incorporate nature, but even more important, redevelop decaying inner city neighborhoods and suburbs and redundant aging shopping malls, where these are transformed into eco-villages that not only provide more natural habitat, green roofs and button parks and wildlife corridors, but also support higher human populations than today's suburbs. Where neighborhoods are no longer surrounded by walls to keep people out, but by orchards for children to harvest. Where urban and rural human settlements become purposeful places, where natural history becomes as important as human history to our regional and personal identities, to who we are. Where history is defined less by the battle of war and more by the stories of our kinship. Imagine a world in which small towns now deserted across the Great Plains return in new form, internet connected, surrounded by organic farms, edible prairies, and beauty. Where streams in cities and countryside are restored, unearthed to the daylight, their natural curves and life returned. A newer world where the point of education is not rote and drill, but wonder and awe. Where education uses the power of the natural world to stimulate our ability to learn and create. Where hybrid minds are nurtured, amplifying the sensory and creative benefits of both virtual and natural experience. Where every school has a natural space where children experience the joy of learning through play once again. Where teachers are encouraged to take their students on field trips to the nearby woods and canyons and streams and shores, where educators feel their own sense of hope and excitement returning to their profession and to their own hearts, where connecting people to nature becomes a growth industry, where new businesses emerge to help us transform our homes, our workplaces, our lives through nature, where the restorative and healing powers of the natural world and the measurable and immeasurable worth of watersheds and natural systems are included in every regional economic study. A newer world where children and adults feel a deep sense of identity with the bioregions in which they live, where human nature social capital enriches our daily lives, and where as a species we no longer feel so alone. Where children experience the joy of being in nature before they learn of its loss. Where they can lie in the grass on a hillside for hours and watch clouds become the faces of the future. Where every child and every adult has a human right to a connection to the natural world and shares the responsibility for caring for it. Where every child, regardless of race or economic status or gender or sexual identity or abilities, has the opportunity to create that relationship. Imagine a world where the strength of our spirit is not measured by the specificity of our language, but by the care and kinship we share with each other and with our fellow species on this earth. a world in which our last days are lived in the arms of Mother Nature, of land and sky, water and soil, wind and sea, a newer world we seek and to which we return. So that may not be your vision of a good future, a future you'd want to go to, but it's mine. And I know that some of you are thinking that is outrageously idealistic. To which I would say that's the point. We have to have the courage to be idealistic again. I keep thinking, what's it like to be a 14-year-old today surrounded by adults who say it's too late? It's not too late. And where you're sitting here, places like this are showing up around the world, and they give a glimpse of that future, of that newer world. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. I wasn't expecting you quite to end there. I think you've, the vision of the future ties so much into our conversation today. I think there's innovation between a lot of the adults in this room and a lot of the children out in this city. What we have at this moment we're going to invite you Terry, 1, 2. So we have 1 here and 1 here. And we, just so everyone here knows, we have an online audience as well, and they're going to chime in with questions as well. So we might take some questions from our online audience as well. Is that, are we? Okay. So how we're going to do this, before our panelists, before Jennifer joins us up on stage, I'd invite anyone who has a question or wants to comment to Richard to please step up to the mic. And then after that, I'm going to ask everyone to stand because I know some people, including Jennifer, are getting a little chilly. So any questions from the group, please come to the mic or responses. And I think we have our first one right here.
Hello. I really enjoyed your talk. At the beginning, you mentioned something about children and mental health issues. Could you expand a little bit on that, or is there any data to support that, or what's your viewpoint on that?
Well, there is a growing amount of data on the importance of nature experience for children's and adults' health, both physical health and mental health, as well as cognition, ability to learn. The problem is that we don't have very many 30-year longitudinal studies because nobody thought to ask the question 30 years ago. But what we do have is a lot of correlative evidence that is increasing every year. A lot has come out since last child. And it all tends to point in the same direction. Some people might think I cherry-pick these studies in the books, but I don't, because I haven't seen one study that disproves this thesis. But in terms of mental health, for instance, for all of us, not only for children, parks, urban parks with the highest level of biodiversity are the parks with the greatest positive impact on human psychological health and well-being. We are not alone. And I think part of the pathology of our time is that we think we are. There are other studies, for instance, this isn't directly mental health, but attention deficit disorder, ongoing set of studies at the University of Illinois show that kids with the symptoms of attention deficit disorder, just a little bit of contact with nature. They're studying kids in the projects of Chicago, and just a little bit of contact, walk through trees in an urban park, and the symptoms decrease. I cannot tell you how many teachers have spoken to me and said almost exactly the same sentence, almost word for word, which is the troublemaker in the classroom, when I get the class outdoors in nature, becomes the leader. Not just well-behaved, the leader. I hear this again and again. I hear parents saying, Johnny and Judy are different kids when you get them outdoors into nature. In terms of cognitive development, and I don't see a separation between physical health, mental health, and cognitive development. In cognitive development, kids who play in a natural play space have been shown to be far more likely to invent their own games than kids who play on a flat turf or cement playground. That has everything to do with the development of executive function, the ability to be your own boss, maybe someday to be an entrepreneur, to be creative. There's a new study that is unpublished. Ning Kuo, who did many of the studies, they've looked at schools in Chicago, over 500 schools and over 1 million test scores. And they compared schools that have green schoolyards against schools that don't. And schools that didn't have green schoolyards, but then got green schoolyard. By that I mean not energy efficiency, but literally nature in the school and outside the school. And they found that the results of that were astounding in terms of literally test scores on standardized testing. They said the results were as good or better than any other technique they'd seen and measured against during the No Child Left Behind era. And they say it's very cost effective to do that. So I know I wandered away from mental health, but I do see those as related.
Thanks very much. Appreciate that.
Yep. Okay. Other questions? Would you mind stepping to the mic just so everyone can hear? Thank you.
Chicago. Oh, okay, just an observation. I'm in English, academic English. I was reading a report today. This is apropos of your opening statements that sounds unrelated, but I hope it is related. We're talking surveys, you know, educators everywhere. How do you like this course? What would make you like these courses better? How do you enjoy picking your electives? And what depressed the hell out of me over so many of the responses were little and focused on the job and only what I'd need to do that job for which I came and why I'm majoring and why are you making me read books? Shakespeare, for God's sake. Why are any of these, you know, nothing that wasn't what am I going to do for a living mattered to so many of the people. They didn't want to take English. They didn't want to read philosophy. Why? Well, it was just beside whatever they saw their life.
And these are college students?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I went way off from what the report was supposed to be, and I was so saddened by the smallness of the vision that they had of what their future was comprised of. We all have to pay bills. We want them to get jobs and, you know, et cetera, thrive. But what made me most sad was the smallness of what they thought of as an education. And only that, just that I wasn't thinking environment necessarily. I was thinking my own selfish little, why don't they love English more? But it resonated, the idea of how little they how very simple in the wrong sense of the word their vision of what their future would be. Just give me something that will pay me and leave me alone. And so only that I concur.
I have two sons. They're both grown now. The younger son, I knew he had the fishing gene because when he was 3, I caught him fishing in the humidifier, and he did pretty well. And the older son fished to humor me, and he was very kind about it. Both of them live in cities now. And the older son has his own website, and he's very idealistic and really taking on the world. The younger son is a stand-up comedian in San Francisco, living out my fantasy. And I keep offering to write material for him, but he won't go for it. Neither of them have big student loans. We got them through college. That was our goal, get them through, save enough money to get them through the UC system with no student debt. So I have a lot of sympathy for those students who are so focused so tightly on getting a job, because we've done a terrible thing to them, at least in the United States. We've saddled them with debt that we wouldn't want. And why did we do that? Why did our system do that? That's part of it. The other thing is, I think they're not in a vacuum. They're in a vacuum that I think I tried to describe earlier, that is not talking about the future in a positive way. And I don't mean a Pollyanna way. I mean a way that accepts these as huge, huge, perhaps insurmountable challenges, but by God, we're going to challenge. We're going to try to do it, and it's going to be better. We're going to make it better. Do they have a society that encourages that? I don't think so. Now, having said that, millennials are doing some interesting things. They're not driving as much. They're riding bikes more. They're moving into central cities. And I don't see, as you could guess, central cities as being the anathema of nature. I think central cities can flourish, can become engines of biodiversity with good design, biophilic design, things like this. There are some evidence, I think, that they value cars less and friendship more. So I'm not sure about the surveys that are gloom and doom about young people. And I have to tell you that when I visit colleges, like those young people I described, I'm always inspired. I'm saddened by the fact that that young woman said all her life she'd been told it's too late. But on the other hand, they're there. They're dressed up, they're ready, they're showing up. And when you shift the conversation from just survival to creating something new and beautiful, when you talk about the fact that as of 2008, more people in the world live in cities than in the countryside, first time in human history, when you say that means one of two things, either the end of the human relationship with the rest of nature, potentially in any kind of relevance, or it means the beginning of a new kind of city. I like door B. They do too. When they start talking about creating that, their affect changes. If they're only talking about solar panels and survival, their affect looks like that. You start talking about new kinds of wonderful, beautiful cities. You take them here, give them a tour of this, you'll see a different affect. That's an awfully long answer to that statement.
Why don't we take another question here at the back? Thank you, Richard.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk and your books and your inspiration. I want to ask the political question, and I've got to say where I come from because there's an election going on in Ontario right now. I'm from Calgary, Alberta, and you mentioned the civil rights movement, and as I'm probably as old as you are, and was part of that movement as well, both in the United States and in Canada. And clearly the vision was there and the mobilization for that vision. But I remember Lyndon Johnson saying to Martin Luther King, "You produce the people, and I'll produce the legislation." And Lyndon Johnson did that with the Civil Rights Act. There was a counterpoint, a complementarity of the political vision and leadership and grassroots movement for social change. We live in a country, I don't want to say anything about your situation, but I live with two governments. Well, I live with two governments, one in Alberta and the federal government in Canada, who have zero vision, who do not have any idea of the big picture and trying to inspire us towards that. I want to say that John Godfrey was an outstanding member of Parliament. And those of us who were involved in a number of issues met with John Godfrey on a range of things, and he was a visionary in Parliament, and I'm sure he left with a certain amount of frustration. But right now, things are even worse than when John was there, at least in Alberta and in Canada. So I'm interested in your comment about the lack, almost total, and I'm not talking about Ontario or some cities. We have a great mayor in Calgary who has a vision for a city that moves into the future with that kind of thing.
So Calgary. Let me say that first.
So you know, what do we do with that? It's only one piece of the puzzle, but it's a very important piece of the puzzle.
And I think you're absolutely right. I love that. What was the Lyndon Johnson quote again? Because I've heard that. But
well, when on one of the meetings he had with King, he said, "You produce the people, and I'll produce the legislation."
Okay, let me tell you a story. I was asked to be the keynote speaker at the very first White House Summit on Environmental Education about a year and a half ago. I went to DC. I said yes. I went to DC, of course, and the day before I was supposed to speak, I learned that I had been asked to do this 2 days after the Obama administration had killed $35 million in environmental education federal funds, the whole ball of wax. So I said, oh great, I've been set up as the apologist. And I was going to face 150 really ticked off environmental education leaders at this White House Summit. Fortunately, they shifted me to the end of Keynote, and they sacrificed the Secretary of Education at the beginning. But I thought I had enough time to think this through. And so what I said when I got up, I said, you know, when I woke up this morning, I was thinking about the movie Jaws. And I know that's a terribly environmentally incorrect movie, and I don't care, I love it. And you remember that moment in the movie and in the book where the guys look around and they realize just how big a shark they're dealing with, and one of them says, we need a bigger boat. I said that to the environmental educators. We need a bigger boat. As long as the environmental educators are only talking to environmental educators, you got a really small boat. And by bigger boat, I mean creating a new constituency. I mean providing the people. One of the neat things about the Children in Nature movement that has emerged, you know, there's 130 or so, the numbers keep going up, of regional, state, national campaigns. In Canada, I'm the honorary chair with Robert Bateman of the Children in Nature Alliance. You've got a great campaign here in Ontario, Back to Nature campaign, which has, I think, 80 organizations signed up, and you've got a Bill of Rights thing signed here in Ontario on that. This has spread very, very quickly. You've got family nature clubs spreading across North America and now into Australia and elsewhere. These are multiple families that band together to go to the park on Saturday, and 2, 3, 5 families at a time deal with their fear of strangers by going to. And it works, and believe me, parents have a lot of fear. And, you know, it may not be founded always in reality. My profession has created a lot of that fear. Actually, the number of violent crimes toward children about 3 decades. In any case, you've got spreading, you've got what we call natural features that are starting to natural artists network of very quickly. That's creating a bigger boat. And one of the great things about this issue, other than being a very important issue itself of connecting children to nature in and of itself, it has this other quality, this utilitarian quality. It brings people together. And it doesn't seem to matter what somebody's politics or religion is. They almost always want to tell me about the tree house they had when they were kids, that special place in nature that is still in their hearts. So I've seen conservatives sit down with liberals. They don't even want to be in the same room, but they're at the same table on this issue. And pediatricians sit down with educators, sit down with conservationists, sit down with developers at the same table. Nobody wants to be in the last generation where it's considered normal and expected to go outside and dig a hole as a kid and build a little fort to play and dream and look up through those limbs at the sky. Nobody wants to be in the last generation of that. That is powerful stuff. You start there, and you start at a place in people's hearts that has real power. So that is part of that, supplying the people. We really do have to do that. We've looked to leaders too much, political leaders. We've assumed that Obama on the white horse would show up. And that's a mistake. It's always a mistake when it comes to leadership. Leadership is you. And we need to build that bigger boat. Thanks.
Well, yeah, sure. Let's take the question.
Richard, I'm Richard also. I arrived 2 days ago from Tanzania and Kenya. I've been living there for 4 years. It's a different world. It's a developing country where the relationship between people is very different than it is here. I'm Canadian, but 4 years ago I chose to go to East Africa to work as a professor in a school on the coast in Kenya. So my observations of the community are much different. The sense of community is much different. The care of nature, the care of each other, the sense of your neighbor being a very important part of your life, or even the people across the road. The tribal nature of the communities is much different than it is here. I guess what I'm trying to point out is that there's a prerequisite to your comments, and that is, if there isn't a culture of community, if there isn't a culture of church, if there isn't a culture of caring, we don't have a lot of direction to move. Could you make some comments on that, please?
I think that it is right under the surface. I don't think we have media that reflect that. You know, sometimes it's like we're on the other side of a one-way mirror, and we're only seeing ourselves, when actually there's lots of people on the other side of the mirror, and they're waiting. There's another issue here too, which is a prerequisite, which is our relationship with other animals and plants. But I'm increasingly interested in that relationship. I just spoke with Sven Lindblad of Lindblad Expeditions that takes the ships to the Antarctic and Galapagos. He's a really good guy. His father essentially created ecotourism. And he spent in the 70s a year and a half studying elephants in Africa. And he said he learned everything he would ever need to know about dealing with people and creating a business from the elephants he studied. He never saw intentional meanness or cruelty. He saw elephants battle each other. It was about territory, but this intentional almost for the joy of it, cruelty. He never saw. He saw animals that took care of each other and felt deeply and were incredibly loyal. That's how he runs his business. I think that we're, and this is something I'm thinking about writing about, I think we're on the cusp of maybe a new campfire. We've always told stories about animals. We stopped telling those stories a while back, except for stories that distanced us from other animals in the sense of science. Just, you know, talk about them scientifically, or cute kitten videos on YouTube. I think right behind those is a whole hunger, a deep hunger for other animals, that we are a deeply lonely species. It's not only that we are lonely for each other and lack community with each other, it's that we lack that attachment that I'm sure you saw there to other creatures. So I think part of the great challenge and part of the great comfort of the future will be to see not only people on the other side of that one-way mirror, but other creatures as well.
Yeah. All right. What we're going to do now is, I know there's a couple questions, and we're going to have a second chance. So if you could hold those for now. And we're going to move to our panel. I want to say just a couple comments, and then I'll introduce Jennifer. But Richard, when we first met back in, I think it was 2008 in Victoria, Bob Pert's gathering, when a pan-Canadian movement was sort of coming together. And I remember we had a moment where we were both, it was one of the open space kind of workshops where, you know, you're allowed to flit around like a butterfly if you want to. And I think Richard and I were both flittering about at that moment, not really engaged with any of the workshops, and found ourselves sitting beside each other. And at that moment, you were pestering me because, and I thought it would be the other way around, but you were faster on the draw than I was. And you wanted to get at this whole idea of what would become your next book. You were saying, we need this portrait of the future, and we need to name it. We need to find the language for it. You know, and I certainly didn't offer much to the, you know, I think you left rather quickly knowing that I didn't offer much. And actually, I think we spoke for an hour. You humored me. And then it was interesting because, of course, your next book came out, but I think this piece that you just gave us, which is sort of after, and has now become the postscript in your recent book, is really a very powerful vision. And it paints that portrait that I think you've been searching for and that many of us have. You've given us that tent that I know many people in here, you've built, often your work is described as creating a big tent that we all feel kind of comfortable under. And I think that's very true, and I look and I see many of the people here that felt that kind of comfort in coming under a bigger tent and feeling the comfort of a vision. And the time is right, I think. So it's very energizing and exciting, and I really appreciate your comments this evening. So at this point, we're going to transition, really keep the conversation going, and offer more chance for questions. But we have another special guest in Jennifer Keesmaat. And Jennifer is our chief planner here for the City of Toronto, for those of you that don't know her. She's only been on the job for about 18 months, but she's creating a buzz. And she's an avid communicator, and so we wanted to get her here in conversation because we thought it might stimulate us in a few other directions. It might stimulate some questions. So Jennifer's commitment and interest is really creating places where people flourish. And she's had a private practice, she's been in private practice in city planning, and she's been awarded, she's got many awards from the Canadian Institute of Planners, the Ontario Professional Planners Institute,
Design Exchange, EDRA, for her innovative work in Canadian municipalities. Some of you may know her from her TED Talks. She's got one that she did out in Regina on the walk to school, which I think I might ask you about tonight. And she also has a second one called Own Your City, which is also the name of your blog, I believe, as well, where you can, I find, probably one of the more transparent chief city planners in this country, and I think we're better off for it. So let me introduce Jennifer, and she's going to offer some response to Richard.
Well, let me just begin by saying that it's thrilling to see so many of you here this evening, and it's even more thrilling for me to be sitting here beside Richard, because maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I had the pleasure of picking up your book. I devoured it. I read it from cover to cover. I came home. I said, kids, take off your shoes. Get out in the backyard in your bare feet. And I decided I wanted bare feet and dirty floors. I didn't care. I wanted their feet on the earth. And that was the first thing that I could think of as a way that I could get them touching the earth, would be to take off their shoes and run around in their bare feet. And we've had a barefoot rule ever since. We try to walk around in our bare feet outside as much as possible. I also said to my daughter, who at that point was about, I think she was probably about 8 years old at the time, she came home, it was summer vacation, we were trying to resist the modern problem parents have of having to put their kids in programs all the time. They're programmed in their schedules all summer long. And I said to my daughter, Alexandra, we are going to measure the success of your summer. The number of hours you spend lying on your back in the grass, watching the clouds go by. That will be the measure of a successful summer, the amount of time to achieve, particularly when you have 2 parents who are working, who are in and out of the house. There's childcare, there's camps. How do you get that time to lie in the grass, that unscheduled time? So I just want to thank you for bringing bare feet back into my life. There's a few observations that I'd like to make, and a few themes that you spoke about that I'd like to pick up on. And really this great risk that we face, that young people today, they don't live in a world with a vision of a future. Now. Years old, and I asked the question in my own head. I know she knows a lot about global warming and climate change, and she talks a lot about the polar bears, and since she was very young has known about the risk to polar bears and species going extinct. She knows about these things intellectually, and as you were speaking, I thought, what does she love? What does she love about the world around her? What does she love about nature? She knows what's going wrong, but has she had a chance to fall in love with the world around her? You know, and thinking, what is it that my child loves enhance and recreate? So that really struck me as a very powerful idea, and it connected with me at a personal level as well, in part because one of the reasons I became a city planner was in part because when I was a young person and I looked around at the world around me, and I too was a product of that environment. My dad, from a very young age, was very aware and conscious of what was happening at an environmental level, and I knew about the butterflies that were disappearing at a very young age. I was aware of that. And I reached a moment when I was in my early teens when I saw the world in two very simple ways. I saw despair, and I was fed a lot of despair from the world. To view the world is through a lens of hope. And I made a conscious decision. I was in my early 20s that I couldn't live with despair. That wasn't the world I could live in. And it was really, what a terrible option to present young people, despair. And so becoming a city planner was about taking ownership over the world in which I live. It was about thinking, feeling that there was an opportunity to be creative, to use our highest intellect, our most sophisticated thinking to, in fact, counter all of the very real challenges in the world with hopeful actions and doing hopeful things. So that was very much, it was almost that critical question that was the impetus for my work in planning practice and becoming a city planner. And I loved it that you began your narrative around what the future could be by giving a whole series of imagined scenarios. Because one of the things that I've often done in my planning work is stood in front of a room of people, and often using photographs, said, let's imagine the future together. What could the future look like? And then showing up, this place often shows up in my slides. The brickwork shows up as an example of imagining a different kind of future. And there's all kinds of examples all over the world of great things that are being done that just slice through that despair and paint a very different portrait of a future that is very positive. So I loved it that you ended with the big imagine, because I think that's where we absolutely must go. And in the absence of doing so, we disempower children, we disempower our young people from knowing that they can in fact be an active participant in creating the kind of world that they imagine, that they want to be a part of. And that in some ways leads to my blog, the title of my blog, which is Own Your City, because in thinking, so I was recruited for this job as a chief planner. And when I was first called, they said, who on earth would want that crazy job? It was a terrifying thought to take on this job. And as I started thinking about it and I thought about my planning practice, I started thinking about the way that I'd approached any project going into any community. I've worked in communities across Canada, and it was about always beginning by recognizing the local assets. What are the assets that we're going to build the future upon? Asset-based planning. And invariably, one of the critical assets going into any community are the people who are engaged in those hopeful actions. They're the most critical asset that any community has. So in thinking about taking on this job as a chief planner, I thought, well, I'm going to have to try and figure out how to bring in as many people into this city who are engaged in building that hopeful future for the city. I have to figure out a way to bring them into the planning process so that they can be a part of creating the city alongside of the municipal bureaucracy. And so Own Your City is really and continues to be an invitation, and it's a place where I try to share information with the objective of creating more access and more opportunity to participate. So I also, it really resonated with me, I think a really very grassroots, this grassroots idea, and I noticed the theme each time you were answering a question, and each of the questions had some despair. There was a tinge of despair, and each time your answer was a very empowering one, which was about, well, what kind of an environment are we creating? What kind of a society do we want to create? How do we create a culture that is about making this vision, this imagined reality, something that we all collectively build. So I loved the way you embodied that thoughtfulness in your answers. And I'll just close with, and you talked about new constituencies, and I think that's really a critical part of building a great city, is about bringing in a whole variety of different constituencies who may not have had ownership over the planning process in the past. For example, we have a lot of collaborations taking place right now with public health and with doctors, and making the linkages between city planning and health at a very tangible level. I just want to link all of this into a really tangible example, because you talked about the importance of actually creating nature, creating environments that are going to sustain us and refresh us. And the city is that we have one of the most progressive green roof policies in the world. Some of you may be familiar with this. We also are going through an incredible building boom. In the next 4 years, we are going to build more green roofs than any other city in the world. We've essentially taken a great leap forward. And just to put a number on that, we will have in 4 years the equivalent of 40 CFL football fields worth of green roofs within the city of Toronto. And what we're doing through building those green roofs, we're transferring our air quality. We're transforming our stormwater management and absorbing water at its source and purifying water in a whole new way. And that's just kind of, I think, one really tangible example that jumped out for me when you're talking about our cities as being these places of flourishing where we recreate our environment in a way that can sustain us as being so critical. So those are some of my observations. I'd like to lead in with a couple of questions. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So my first question is really about, I want to go back to children. It's about children in public space and children in cities. And I am really struggling with this in a very tangible way. We are doing a great job in the city of Toronto urbanizing, particularly our underdeveloped areas, our areas where we already have infrastructure. We are the fastest growing city in North America. A tremendous amount of that growth is going right into our downtown core. We have over 140 high-rise buildings under construction. One of the things we're very, very late to the game at considering is places for children. And we have a tension in our city around public space and parks. And I'll put the public space in sort of 3 categories. We have those small kind of pocket parks that tend to be relatively highly designed in our very urban environments. We have spaces for dogs, and there's more dogs in the city than there are children. And spaces for dogs is a really, really significant issue in the city. And it's entirely possible that within a generation we will be overrun by dogs. It's not a small issue. It's a very big issue. And then the third kind of public space I would put in the category of the more traditional public space or park space where you can throw a baseball around, or the ravines. Now, how many people in this room, assuming that most of the people here, other than the gentleman from Calgary, are from Toronto, how many people in this city have seen a child, let's say within the past 12 months, playing in a ravine? Oh, so that's probably a fifth of the room. Yeah. That's actually, I find that number quite high. The challenge, the question...
It's a special group.
Is a very special group. Very, very special group. Oh! On topic.
Oh, that's great.
A little wild in the city.
That's great. Yeah, upstage by a
That's
raccoon.
great. Better than a bat.
Better than what?
A bat.
Just wait and see what we've got next. They'll be walking
Yeah.
across the stage soon.
A pterodactyl will go by.
Forget your So my question is about freedom, and there's a link and a connection, I think, between
That's great.
Yes, in fact, I have.
So the question is about children and freedom, and I've been exploring this question, very concerned about this question from the perspective of children occupying public space and the way we design public space to welcome children. And I'm curious about best practices. Obviously, the work that Cam does here is very interesting, but it's very much a destination. Neighborhood kids, you know, my kids, we don't live too far from here, but it'd be hard pressed for them to wander down here on a Saturday
regular
afternoon.
basis.
That's right. So how do we